Welcome again to our online Bible class from Pine Valley Church of Christ. We are continuing our study of the book of Exodus, and we have come to that point where they have the exiles who have made their way out of Egypt by the power of God and who have been cared for by him, and he provides them water and food and all the things they need to survive, have now traveled for a couple of months and have made their way into the plains around the Mount Sinai. And it is here that they spend the next 11 months based on the dates we are given here in Exodus and then later in Numbers chapter 10. And God really wants to focus in on their understanding of what it means to be in a covenant relationship with him and with each other. And so he begins to lay out this idea of what it means to live under his law. And I'm going to pull up our screen share at this time. We hear a lot in the news sometimes about the importance of the rule of law, that nobody is above the law. We complain that other countries do not live by a rule of law, but sort of go out on their own rogue way of dealing with things, or rulers in other countries. Or in our country, we always complain about those who disagree with us as to how we should apply the law. And God wants us to understand that this is not about our thoughts, our opinions, or how we want to do things. This is about who he is and about how he is sharing with us is the best way for us to live in covenant with him and with each other. And this is very different than what is referred by that contrast of rule of law with rule by law. Rule by law is what the British and other European countries, and even the United States, when they colonized other countries around the world, they set about all of these laws, but they were not applied equally to those who were natives to those countries as they were applied to those who were British or Americans or other European countries. There was a great difference, and consequently, they saw themselves as being ruled by law. It was the law being used to suppress them, to keep them down. And the Israelites had faced that in Egypt. They had been suppressed because they were a growing minority that was seen as a danger to those who were in power. And God wants to make sure that they understand the importance of the rule of law, his teaching, his Torah. And as I mentioned to you last week, the base root of the idea of Torah is something that is revealed, something that is taught, instructed. And that's what God is doing here. He is revealing how people are to live in this new life. They are no longer slaves. They are no longer in Egypt. They are no longer to be influenced by those Egyptian gods or the gods of the other nations around them, but only by their God and who he is and how that applies over into everyday life. As a quick background, to remind everybody that in last week's lesson, we saw how Moses had been sort of overwhelmed by all the people who were complaining and grumbling, not only about their lack of food or water, but about each other. And so Moses was spending all day, every day, dealing with these rules or making rulings in these disputes among the people. And his father-in-law, Jethro, says, you need to set up judges. And so he does, over tens, over hundreds, over thousands. They take care of the basic cases that are brought before them. And then Moses deals only with those that are extremely difficult. And so in many ways, what we have here, especially beginning in chapter 22, is this discussion and laying down of how these judges are to then deal with certain situations, all of it being based on the 10 commands that are given in chapter 20. But it all begins in chapter 19. And the people have surrounded the mountain. They've camped there. It is an area, the plains of Sinai. The word there designates something that not is total desert, but does have grazing land for all of their livestock. And of course, God is providing them with daily food and with water. But he wants to reiterate to them just who their God is. They had witnessed things that had happened to the people of Egypt at the hands of God, but they had not experienced everything themselves because they were differentiated from. They had been set apart by God as his people, not to suffer most of the plagues. But now he wants them to see on the very same mountain where Moses had come into contact with Yahweh, God of Israel, in the burning bush. We now have that same type of picture on a much grander scale in chapter 19 as the people make their way there, and the might and glory and awesomeness of God descend on the top of the mountain. And there's a great cloud of smoke, and there's fire and lightning. And many have speculated that what is being discussed here is a volcanic eruption. He used natural disasters, but in a grand scale in the 10 plagues to get his point across to Egypt. He could have done it this way. I don't know that it's not described that way, really. And it seems to be more of the grand, much greater scale picture of the burning bush. Now, here is a burning mountain, something made of stone, and it is on fire. It does allow Moses and Aaron and others to make their way up to the top of the mountain to speak with God and to come down. But before this grand scale demonstration, the people, we are told after the description of it, there's the great descent of God upon the mountain. The ground shakes around them. There is this verse 18 of chapter 19, Mount Sinai was covered with smoke because the Lord descended on it in fire, and the smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. And the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, and the people spoke, and Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. And then he calls Moses up. But we're given a little bit more description later in chapter 20 that the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw this mountain in smoke, and they trembled with fear, and they stayed at a distance. And they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. Do not have God speak to us, or we will die." God gets their attention, and he brings them into a moment of awe and wonder of who their God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, is. And as he is revealing to them, as he is going to be instructing to his law, his Torah, as it relates to their relationship to him and their worship of him, and especially to their lives of each other. Here in chapter 19, he emphasizes in verses 4 through 6 what he has done. I am the one who brought you out of Egypt. I brought you out on the wings of eagles. And so you must respond in obedience and keep my covenant. And then out of all the nations, you will be my treasured possessions. I will, he says, then make you into a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And these are the words that you are to listen to. I have done this, and you must respond to that, because in response to your obedience, then I will continue to be with you. I will make you my representatives to the world around you, who I am also interested in, he is telling them, and you will become my people, my representatives, my kingdom and my priest to the world around you. And it's a powerful promise made at the beginning of the scene, and is also re-emphasized at the end of chapter 23, which sort of brings this whole section to a conclusion. But it is here when we come to chapter 20 that we are told about the words that are spoken, the 10 commandments, the Torah foundations, as they are revealed to the people. And we spent time on these in an extended way on Sunday. So I'm going to go through them very quickly for us today, because I want us to get on to chapter 21 through 23 and look at the application that is made, and especially in some specific areas and how it relates to the world in which we live today. But it all comes from these foundations. And it begins with, first and foremost, the establishment of what it is all based on. I am the Lord, or Yahweh, your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Here's the foundation. This is who I am. This is the authority in which I carry. And so this is why I can dictate to you how you must behave. This takes on a very standard covenant formula, as was part of the ancient world. It begins with the one who is in charge, the foundation of that power, and then begins to emphasize other things. And you will have no other before me. And the language here, and it comes out in the next several verses as well, 4 through 6, lends itself to the idea of this relationship, and you are not to defile that relationship. And it uses language that's similar to the committing of adultery in a marriage, and is a theme that is picked up later on by the prophets, that by worshiping other gods and by not obeying God, that they are actually committing adultery in this covenant that they have entered into with God. And so no other gods before me. You'll not make for yourself any graven image or anything in heaven or on earth or beneath it in the waters below. And you'll not bow down to them and worship, for I am Yahweh your God, and I am a jealous God, punishing the children of the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commands. Put me first and foremost in your life, giving no allegiance to any other, and especially don't be making images of these other gods, which in itself shows that there is a dedication or a worship of another God, but don't even do it of God, because when we start making images of something, that we enter into a mindset that we understand that, or we have a better feel for it, or closeness to it. And God wants them to understand, as he has descended on top of this mountain in great fire and lightning and smoke, that he can't put him in a box. His very name is I am that I am. I will be who I will be. We must let God be God, and not think that we can come to our own personal understanding of him, so that we can put him in a box, or think that we can manipulate him, which was a part of pagan worship of their time and of the world today. And he says, don't betray me. Just don't misuse the name of God, or some of the older translations, don't take the Lord's name in vain. In the Jewish Publication Society translation, you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. In other words, don't say, using my name, that you're going to do something, or that you're going to obey me, or that you are one of my people, and then not keep that oath. And this takes in everything from making an oath to someone else in God's name, to the hypocritical act of saying, I belong to God. I am a follower of God, but then we don't live like it. We don't follow these commands that he has given us to live by in our life. And that is betrayal. And this is all part of covenant relationship because he is Yahweh God who brought the people out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. And it leads to something that he's going to discuss at length later in these chapters today of, get the rest, the Sabbath rest. This is based on the creation story and that he created everything in 6 days. And on the seventh day, he ceased or took rest. He reflected on what he had made and declared it to be very good. And he's reminding them at this point that they're not slaves anymore. They are now his people. They don't belong to the Egyptians, and they don't have to work 7 days a week. In fact, he wants them to rest, and he wants them to reflect on the life that he has given them, reflect on his creative acts, and look at the world around us and come to appreciate it and understand the importance of rest, which he expounds upon here in just a little bit. But he goes on, he now shifts from our relationship with God to our relationship to other people. So honor your parents. Make sure there is the proper respect there. And that doesn't matter how old your parents are or how old you are. It is something that you carry on throughout your entire life, and you try to teach your children so that it carries on with them. And if you are doing this in a godly way, it is something that you can pass on from generation to generation, and has that promise of you. And if you do this, you will live long in the land, which is not a promise of the length of our own physical life, but for the time in which the people of Israel will live in that promised land that he had promised to Abraham. And of course, later on, they are expelled from it because some of the things that are mentioned are they not only have betrayed God, they have committed adultery against him, but they are not honoring their parents. And other horrible things are going on. You shall not murder. You shall not seek intentionally to take somebody else's life. And that is what is being talked about here. And he's going to go on in chapter 21 to talk about there's other types of death that take place that don't constitute murder. And he wants them to understand the difference. But don't be seeking your own personal desires. And this sort of goes back to that picture of Cain and Abel, where Cain is jealous of his brother and he murders him in a very intentional way. Don't commit adultery. Don't be married to one and seeking the affections of another, or even going to live with that other and be in a relationship with them where you break the covenant with your married partner. This is something, again, you're not keeping your promise or your covenant and treating marriage as it was created by God with Adam and Eve and the commitment that they were to have to each other. Don't be seeking your own gain, whether it is through the theft of somebody else's property, whether it is bearing false witness and getting paid for that, which he talks again about later. Don't be lying about other situations and taking advantage of others, and even the desire or the coveting of a neighbor's house or his wife or his manservant or maidservant. And this thing that builds up within your heart, which is more than just, oh, that's a beautiful thing. That is something I truly desire, and I'm going to make plans to attain that for myself. And that can be somebody else's wife. It can be somebody else's property. It can be a lot of different things. And those are the type of attitudes that Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 5 and dealing with the desires of the heart, what comes from the heart, and the way in which we deal with each other, and whether it leads to the treating someone badly, or committing adultery, and other things that all come from what's inside of us. Now, out of this, he says, starting in chapter 21, these are the laws you are to set before them. That is often referred to. This is a discussion of the time, or the book of the covenant. Here's how you apply these things. And all of them sort of come back in one way or another to these 10, and especially those two divisions, our relationship with God, our relationship with others, which later, of course, become known as they are defined in Deuteronomy and Leviticus. Love God with all your heart, all your being, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those things which Jesus says everything else depends on. And so he begins to talk about, and what I've referred to here as Torah Academy. Here is how this revelation, this instruction, applies to everything, different kinds of situations in life. And again, without going into extreme detail and looking at every single verse in these 3 chapters, we see some very important themes that come out, and that are very important to the world in which we live still today. And one of them is the protection of the weak, those who are helpless. It has been easy for us to look at those who are poor, who are struggling, that they just need to get a job and work hard. They need to pull themselves up. They need to just try harder. And there's a lot of people who are in situations in this world who simply cannot do that, whether it's because of physical or mental restrictions, or whether it is just the world into which they have been born, and there are systems in place that keep them oppressed. And he talks about this in various and sundry ways. At the beginning of chapter 21, it's talking about if you have a Hebrew servant, well, what's the basis? What is the need for that? Well, someone owes someone. He is in debt. He has no other way of paying that debt except to become the slave of that person. But he says there's going to be limits to this. He is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year, he shall go free without paying anything. He is set free. And even later on in Deuteronomy, it talks about when you set them free, you are to give them clothes, and you're to try to help them get back on their feet now that they are free to take care of each other. But this is about paying off debt. But there's also protections for the one who is the slave owner. If you take your own wife with you and you have children, when you have paid off the debt, they go with you. If you come into as a slave and the owner gives you a wife and you have children by them, those remain his, as part of his household. And the man can say, I want to stay with you. And here's the provision that he can have his ear pierced, which is a voluntary way of saying, yes, I will remain your slave because you have treated us well. We have a good family life here. And so I volunteer for the rest of my life to be your servant. And he goes on and discusses some other ideas. We'll come back to those in just a minute. But a lot of it has to do with taking care of the poor. And he comes back to that again in chapter 22, beginning in verse 25. If you lend money to one of my people among you who is needy, do not be like a money lender. Charge him no interest. If you take his cloak as pledge, in other words, you're expecting him to give the money back, and you will give him his cloak back. But be sure to make sure to give it to him back by sunset, because for them, his cloak is his only covering. He has for his body. What else will he sleep in? And when he cries out to me, I will hear, and I am compassionate. And throughout this last part of chapter 22, there are several different situations where God tells them not to take advantage of others, And when the people cry out to him, this is his nature, to care for those who are weak, who are helpless, those who are in a difficult situation in life. And that includes the poor, those who are in debt. And it carries over even into the idea of Sabbath. Again, verse 10 of chapter 23, for 6 years you will sow your fields and harvest the crops, but during the 7th year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. Then the poor among your people may get food from it, and the wild animals may eat too. And do the same with your vineyards and olive groves. Those of you who have land and should be saving up for the time that you take a Sabbath off for the whole year. And then, but you allow the poor to still go out into those fields and get the things that they need because they don't have the same things that you do. And so even in that kind of setting, they make sure that the widows, the poor, are taken care of. Widows and orphans are given great honor throughout the Old Testament and through Scripture in general. Chapter 22, verse 22, do not take advantage of a widow or an orphan. If you do, then they will cry out to me, and I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will be aroused, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives will become widows themselves, and your children will become orphans. Don't be seeking to take advantage of those who are weak. Don't try to make them work longer than they should. Don't make them take advantage of them. Don't try to charge them interest. Don't do anything, because it is God's very nature to seek to protect and care for those who are in the weak position, because he knows that is what happens in this world. He, a couple of times here, verse 21 of chapter 22 talks about how we treat those who are aliens, refugees, foreigners who come into the land. Chapter 21, do not mistreat an alien or oppress him as you were aliens in Egypt. Do not oppress an alien, verse 9 of chapter 23. You yourselves know how it feels to be aliens because you were aliens in Egypt. They have felt the sting of the oppression of those who were in power and wanted to remain in power, and so oppressed them, put them into slavery. And he says, you are not to do that to anybody, because these are all my people. These are all my creation, and you are going to treat all of them with respect. And that's one of the things that comes throughout this whole thing, is the respect that is due everyone, whether they are weak, whether they're poor, whether they're rich, no matter what. In fact, even in the giving of justice, they are to make sure. We see in verse 20, chapter 23, verse 3, don't give false, beginning in verse 2, again, talking about false testimony in a lawsuit. Do not pervert justice by siding with the crowd. Do not show favoritism to a poor man in his lawsuit. We go down to verse 6, do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits. Have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death. For I will acquit the guilty. The last part of verse 3, do not show favoritism. It doesn't matter who the person is, because there are people in this country and around the world who immediately think of, because a person is well off, that they are evil and don't care about anybody else. And so they should be punished. They come into it with a bias. Others see the poor, the weak, as those who don't want to work hard, haven't tried hard. They are simply trying to take advantage of the system. He says, don't show favoritism to anybody. Give the same respect to all. In fact, it's interesting that he says in verse 28, of chapter 22, do not blaspheme God or claim to be one of his and then be a hypocrite, or curse the ruler of your people. And it doesn't matter who the ruler is. It doesn't matter whether we agree with them or not. We are in the midterm election cycle here in the United States. And it's amazing the things that are being said about other candidates. No way of knowing whether they're true or not. There's just a lot of slander and lies going on. And even of those who are already in elected position of leadership. And here he's going to be talking about the leadership of your people, which is the people of God. So be careful about how you talk about those who are in leadership among the church, but also those who are in leadership in our country. This is picked up on by Paul in Romans 13, where he says, remember that those who are in the positions of power in government are there because of God. It is his will. He has placed them there, and they need to be given the respect that they should get. But everybody should get the respect that they are due, no matter who they are, no matter how much money they have, no matter what political party they belong to. All of these people belong first and foremost to God. And so we seek to treat them that way. And that's what he's talking about through this whole thing, is how do we live truly in a civil society, and Israel in particular, because they are going to be their own nation that is set apart from everybody else around them. But it has an application to his people today that we have to make sure that we are doing these things. And one of the areas that really is emphasized through there here that is important for us to look at is his protection of women. Here on the screen, you see the idea of justice and redemption. There are several what we would call commands to capital punishment. Anyone who strikes a man and kills him shall surely be put to death, because of murder. If a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him from an altar and put him to death. Anyone attacks his father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who kidnaps another and either sells him, in other words, they're involved in slave trade or sex trafficking, we might say today, and sells him or still has him when he is caught, he is to be put to death. Anyone who curses his father or mother is to be put to death. That's what these things deserve. And yet there is always the opportunity for redemption, to pay back, whether it is the payback can be the taking of a life that has taken someone else's life, but it can also be the idea of the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot, burn for a burn, wound for a wound, bruise for bruise, in verses 23 through 25 of chapter 21. But he goes on to talk about how this can be, how this should actually be applied. If you have a manservant or a maidservant, you destroy the eye, you must let the servant go to compensate for the eye. You knock out a tooth, you have to let the servant go to compensate for the tooth. In other words, if you mistreat your slave or your servant, you have to let them go as compensation for that. That's how you redeem for the action, your bad behavior. Even later on, if a man has a bull that is known to be destructive and he doesn't do anything about it, and is pinned up and it kills a man or a woman, the bull must be stoned, verse 29, and the owner must be put to death, verse 30. However, if payment is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. In other words, redemption, the paying for of the damage that has been done, for the sin that has been committed. And of course, this establishes the whole idea of the redemption that we find as Christians in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that he pays for our sin, and we are redeemed and allowed to come back into a proper relationship with God and with one another. But again, each affects the other. We are to allow our relationship with God to affect how we treat other people, and then we should show in our relationship with other people what we think of our God and how much we have given ourselves to him. But there's one other area here where I want to talk about before we get to the promise that is given in the end of this section, and it is protection that is given to women throughout here, whether it's a female slave, verse 7 and following of chapter 21. A man could sell his daughter as a slave to help pay off a debt, but it had to do with, it was assumed that she would either become the wife or the concubine of the owner or of his son. But verse 8, if she does not please the master who has selected her for himself, he must let her be redeemed. In other words, the family could pay and take care of the debt so that she could go free. He must let her be redeemed. If he has no right to sell her to a foreigner or strangers, because he has broken faith with her. He had chosen her to come into his family and be a part of that. Now he has decided that he does not want her to be. She has displeased him in some way. And that constitutes the breaking of faith. And so he must allow her to be redeemed. He must set her free. And it even goes on to say, if he selects her for his son, he must grant her the rights of a daughter. In other words, he must not touch her. He must treat her as one of his own family. But if he then marries another woman, he must not deprive the one that he has already married of her food, clothing, and marital rights. If he does not provide her with these three things, she is to go free without any payment of money. There is not to be the playing of any favorites. We can go back to the story of Sarah and Leah, or Rachel and Leah with Jacob, Sarah and her concubine, Abraham, the struggles that go on there in between those kind of relationships. And God doesn't want that. He wants all to be, again, treated with the respect that they should have in these relationships. And if you're unwilling to provide for those basic needs of one, she is to go free. She is to be protected in that kind of situation and not have to pay any money. She can go back to her family and find protection there. It moves on then into the protections that women have even in accidental deaths or injuries, which is most of the rest of chapter 21. And I bring these up because this is a verse that has been used by those who are pro-abortion to say, even the Bible shows that the unborn child does not have any real value or protection, but they're not reading it correctly. So let's let it say what it says and not try to go beyond any of that. But it says, if men, starting in verse 22, chapter 21, if men who are fighting hit a pregnant woman and she gives birth prematurely or she has a miscarriage, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. The Jewish Publication Society translates it like this. When men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman and the miscarriage results, but no other damage ensues, the one responsible shall be fined according to the woman's husband may exact from him, and the payment is based on the reckoning or the as determined by the judges. And this actually seems to refer to the damage of the miscarriage taking place. There's no other damage to the woman except this. And there are other societies in this time who, if this type of situation happened, then damages were paid according to the age of the fetus. You know, the older the fetus got, the more the payment was, because it was closer to being born and becoming a part of society. And it was also paying damages to the family because they had lost a potential member of the family, a potential heir, and a living being. But it goes on to talk about, but if there is serious damage, injury, you take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. You are to pay for the whatever damage comes to the life of the mother, of the woman. So there is value placed upon the miscarriage here. It's accidental, but there is value upon that. But there's also understood that there is greater value and there's great importance placed upon the health and the welfare of the mother. And so if we claim to have a appreciation for all life, we must also make sure that we are protecting the health and the welfare of the mother, the one who is giving life to this fetus, the one who can give future life to other children. And that is what is actually being discussed here. And we must just let it say what it says, and then make sure that we are seeking to develop our thoughts about the ideas of abortion, exceptions in terms of the health of the mother and so forth, based on these principles as truly given by God of the value of life, including the life of the mother and the protection that is granted for them here. He goes on again in chapter 22 to talk about the importance of protecting women. We look at verse 16 and 17. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. Deuteronomy expands upon it that you must take her as your wife, and if you do so, you cannot divorce her for any reason. But notice what it also says here. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, the one who has seduced the virgin or who has raped the woman must still pay the bride price for the virgin. He must still pay that price. It protects the reputation of the family. It protects the reputation of the woman. It makes it known that he is the one who is in the wrong. And again, the protection to women. Who are another class of, especially in their day and time, and even up until recent times, those who are weak, who are in vulnerable positions because of their place in society at the time. And a lot of the protections that are given to women in the Mosaic law are not found in a lot of the other contemporary laws of their time. And many do not understand that a lot of the responsibilities, things that are given to women in the New Testament was actually a lifting up of women from the situation in which they faced in society at that time and giving them much more value. Again, this is part of God wanting us to make sure that all receive the respect that they deserve and that we can live in unity with one another. One of the greatest doctrines of the New Testament, the importance of us being in unity with one another. But it all begins with our understanding of our relationship to God and our relationship to each other. Uh, the end of chapter 23 is the promise of God again, of that if you listen, if you keep me first, and if you do all these things, if you do not rebel, verse 21, if you pay attention and listen and do not rebel, I will go before you. I will drive out the peoples before you. I will make sure that you inherit this land. But make sure that you do not worship their gods. You drive them out completely so that they will not be uh, a snare to you. The end of chapter 23, which we see become a major problem for them in the many years to come. Keep me first so that you can live together in unity as my people. And this is the very thing, as he tells them, I will go before you. So listen carefully, but make sure you worship me only. This is what will lead to you being together. That is why when Jesus was asked by a teacher of the law, a lawyer of his time, what was the greatest commands? Jesus says, here's what's been revealed to us by God, that you love God with everything you have and you love your neighbor as yourself. On these two, everything else depends. You can find all of it. You're able to understand it. You are able to apply it properly, not from the rule by law in which you try to suppress others' thoughts, oppress them, take control, be the one who is in command, and put yourself in the position of the authority, be one who, like the Pharisees, had oppressed everybody around them using the rule by law. But rather, this is the proper application of a rule of the law of God. It is based on our love of God and our love for each other and our willingness to do whatever it takes to get along with each other. And this is why Jesus tells it in the Sermon on the Mount. If you go to offer your sacrifice and you realize your brother you have something against him, go to them, make it right first, and then come bring your offering. Your relationship with God depends on your relationship to others, and vice versa. It all connects together. And this has already been established here for the people of Israel thousands of years ago. This is what God has always sought from his people, and something we must continue to seek to do in our lives today, especially as followers of Jesus Christ. We must never take his name in vain, claiming to be his, taking oaths in his name, making promises in his name, and yet seeking our own selfish wants and desires. Thank you for sharing in this study with us. I hope that you will continue to study with us in the weeks to come as we continue through the book of Exodus. And this next section really focuses in on the worship of God and how it is to be done, but why it is to be done in an appropriate way before the Lord God of Israel. So that's where we'll be going in our lesson next week. Between now and then, let us, in all that we do, love God with everything we've got and love our neighbors as ourselves.